Ladies and gentlemen, I want to speak to you today about something that weighs on every human heart. Whether you whisper it in a quiet moment of desperation or cry out in the depths of your soul, the truth is this: you need a blessing from God. And I've come to tell you today, He knows. The Bible says in Psalm 139, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar." There is nothing in your life, no tear you've cried, no battle you've fought, that escapes the eyes of the Almighty. Some of you are here today feeling unseen. Maybe you prayed for healing that hasn't come yet. Maybe the weight of financial burdens presses down on you. Maybe your family is falling apart and you wonder if God has turned His face away. You may be sitting in this place with a heart that's weary, wondering if your prayers are just words lost in the wind. You've laid awake at night, wrestling with fear and uncertainty, asking, "God, do you see me? Do you hear me? Do you even care?" I want you to know today that God not only sees you, He knows you. He knows every detail of your life, from the greatest victories to the deepest struggles. He knows the silent battles you fight, the burdens you carry, and the dreams that seem too far out of reach. He knows your name, your story, your past, your present, and your future. And more than that, He cares. The Bible tells us the story of Hagar, a woman who found herself abandoned in the wilderness, alone and afraid. She had been cast out, left with nothing but her son and an uncertain future. But in her darkest moment, the Lord appeared to her and she gave Him a name, El Roi, the God who sees me. Think about that. In the middle of the desert, when no one else cared, when she thought all hope was lost, God met her there. He didn't just glance her way. He saw her. He saw her pain, her struggle, her heartache. And He sees you too. Maybe today you feel like you're wandering in a wilderness of your own. Maybe you've been rejected, cast aside, left behind. Maybe you feel like you're invisible, like your prayers aren't being heard, like your struggles don't matter. But let me tell you something, they do matter. God is not distant. He's not indifferent. He's not blind to your suffering. He is near to the brokenhearted, and He is working behind the scenes even when you can't see it. Many years ago, I met a man who had lost everything: his job, his home, his health. He told me, "Billy, I don't think God sees me anymore." He felt forgotten, like his prayers were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back unanswered. But friends, I told him what I tell you today. God not only sees you, He is moving on your behalf even when you don't feel it. The greatest mistake we can make is to assume that God's silence is the same as His absence. Sometimes we expect God's blessings to come in a certain way, on our timeline, in a manner that we can understand. But God's ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His blessings don't always come wrapped in the packages we expect. Sometimes the delay is for our protection. Sometimes the struggle is strengthening us for what's ahead. Sometimes the storm we're facing is the very thing that will bring us closer to Him. Think of the disciples in the boat when the storm raged around them. The waves were crashing, the winds were howling, and fear filled their hearts. But Jesus was there. He was with them in the storm, and He is with you in yours. You may feel like the waves are too strong, like the darkness is too heavy, like the struggle will never end, but hear me today. God is in control. The same God who calmed the storm with a word, the same God who parted the sea, the same God who fed thousands with just a few loaves and fish, that same God is the one who holds your life in His hands. And because He knows you, because He sees you, because He loves you, He will bless you. But His blessing isn't always what we expect. It's greater, it's deeper, it's more lasting. It's not just about what He gives you, It's about who He is to you. His greatest blessing is His presence, His peace, His power at work in your life. So don't give up, don't lose heart, keep trusting, keep believing, keep pressing on, because the God who sees you is the God who blesses you. And He knows exactly what you need. We live in a world where blessing is often mistaken for a bigger bank account or a brand new car. People measure success by how much they own, how high they climb, how much comfort they can secure. But the greatest blessings of God are not what's in your hands, but what's in your heart. True blessing is not defined by material wealth, by status, or by the approval of men. It is found in the presence of God, in the peace that surpasses all understanding, in the joy that remains even in suffering. It is found in the assurance that no matter what happens in this life, you belong to Him, and nothing, no hardship, no loss, no storm can separate you from His love. Ask Job, who lost everything he had, his wealth, his children, even his health. He sat in the ashes of his former life, covered in boils, with nothing left but his faith. And yet at the end of his trial, he declared, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." He discovered that the greatest blessing was not in the restoration of his fortunes, but in the deeper knowledge of God that came through his suffering. Ask Paul, who was beaten, imprisoned, and shipwrecked, yet he wrote from a dark Roman prison cell, "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation." He knew what it was to be in need, and he knew what it was to have plenty, but he had learned that true blessing was not in his circumstances, but in the strength of Christ within him. Ask Mary, who was chosen to be the mother of Jesus, who was called blessed among women. But what did that blessing look like? It meant carrying a child before she was married, facing whispers and judgment. It meant watching her son be rejected, ridiculed, and ultimately crucified. Yet she was called blessed, not because her life was easy, but because she carried the greatest gift the world has ever known. God's blessings don't always come in the way we expect. We often pray for comfort, but He gives us strength. We ask for ease, but He teaches us endurance. We seek worldly success, but He offers eternal significance. The world may tell you that blessing looks like having more, but God tells you that blessing is being more faithful, more courageous, more like Christ. Think of the Israelites wandering in the desert. They longed for the comforts of Egypt, even though Egypt had been their place of slavery. How often do we do the same? We look back at what we used to have, longing for what is familiar, even if it was never good for us. But God was leading them to something better. He was taking them to a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of true blessing. The journey wasn't easy. It required faith. It required trust. And many of them missed out because they doubted, because they complained, because they refused to believe that what God had for them was greater than what they had left behind. How many of us are missing out on God's blessings because we are looking in the wrong places? We think blessing is the absence of struggle, but sometimes the struggle is the blessing. We think blessing is about receiving, but sometimes it is about being broken so we can be made new. We think blessing is about what we can hold on to, but sometimes it is about what we are willing to let go of. The greatest blessings of God often come through the refining fire. Gold is purified by heat, diamonds are formed under pressure, and faith is strengthened in the trials of life. When God allows us to go through hardship, it is not because He has abandoned us, but because He is preparing us. He is shaping us, molding us, making us into something more beautiful than we could ever imagine. And in the end, the greatest blessing is not found in what He gives us, but in who He is to us. The blessing is not just in the provision, but in the provider. It is not just in the healing, but in the healer. It is not just in the miracle, but in the presence of the one who walks with us every step of the way. So today, if you feel like your blessing is far away, if you feel like God has forgotten you, if you are looking at your circumstances and wondering where He is, know this: His blessings are not always seen in the moment, but they are real, they are sure, and they are coming. Some of you are waiting for a miracle, but the key is in your hands. Faith is the key that unlocks the blessings of God. It is not just a feeling or a vague hope. It is a deep, unshakable trust in the one who holds the universe together. Faith is what moves mountains. Faith is what calls the dead to life. Faith is what allows us to step into the blessings that God has prepared for us. Think of Peter stepping out of the boat. He saw Jesus walking on the water and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." That was all it took, one word. Peter didn't have a detailed plan. He didn't know how it would work, but he stepped out in faith, and for a moment he walked on water. As long as his eyes were on Jesus, he did the impossible. But when he looked at the waves, when he focused on the storm instead of the Savior, he began to sink. How many of us start out in faith, but then begin to sink because we take our eyes off Jesus? We let fear creep in. We let doubt whisper in our ear. We look at the size of the storm instead of the power of our God. But even when Peter began to sink, Jesus reached out His hand and caught him. He didn't let him drown. And He won't let you drown either. The woman with the issue of blood had been suffering for 12 years. She had spent all she had on doctors searching for a cure, only to grow worse. But one day she heard about Jesus. She didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't stand back and let the crowd keep her from Him. She pressed forward. She reached out and she touched the hem of His garment, and in that moment she was healed. Jesus turned and asked, "Who touched me?" The disciples were baffled. The crowd was pressing in on all sides. How could He ask that? But Jesus knew. He knew that someone had reached out in faith, that power had gone out from Him. And when the woman came forward trembling, He didn't rebuke her. He didn't tell her she was out of line. He looked at her and said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Some of you need to press through the crowd today. You need to reach out in faith. You've let fear hold you back. You've let doubt convince you that your miracle is for someone else, not for you. But Jesus is passing by, and He is waiting for you to reach out. The blessing is there. It has already been prepared. But will you take hold of it? Faith is not passive. It is not just believing in God. It is believing God. It is stepping out before you see the answer. It is trusting when the path is unclear. It is moving forward when everything in you wants to turn back. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in behind them, they had a choice. They could give in to fear, or they could trust God to make a way where there was no way. And what did God tell Moses? Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea. The waters didn't part until Moses obeyed. The miracle didn't happen until they took that step of faith. And when they did, the waters rolled back and they walked through on dry ground. How many of us are standing at the edge of our Red Sea, waiting for God to part the waters when He is waiting for us to take the first step? Some of you have been praying for a blessing, but God is saying, move forward. Some of you have been asking for a miracle, but God is saying, trust me. Faith is what unlocks the blessings of God. It is what moves us from waiting to receiving. It is what takes us from the wilderness into the promised land. And the truth is, God has already prepared the blessing. He has already spoken the promise. He has already made the way. The question is, will you step out in faith? Maybe today you need to be reminded, God knows what you need. He sees you, He loves you, and His blessings are already in motion. Even when the answers seem delayed, even when the path is uncertain, even when you feel forgotten, He is working. His plans for you are good, His timing is perfect, and His promises never fail. But the question is, will you trust Him? Will you have the faith to step out when He calls? Will you press through the crowd even when it feels impossible? Will you lift your hands in worship even when the storm is raging? Because faith is not just about believing that God can, it's about trusting that He will in His way and in His time. Some of you are standing at the edge of your breakthrough, right on the verge of the blessing you've been praying for. But the door will not open until you take that step of faith. Maybe today God is calling you to surrender, to let go of fear, to trust Him fully. Maybe today He is reminding you that the greatest blessing is not in what He gives. So don't give up. Don't lose heart. Keep pressing on. Keep believing. Keep walking forward. Because the God who sees you is the God who blesses you. And when you trust Him with all your heart, you will see His goodness in ways you never imagined. God bless you.